Before written memory, before names or borders, the Japanese islands existed as a quiet meeting place between land and sea. Long coastlines folded into one another, forests rose thick and deep, and mountains divided communities as much as they protected them. In this setting, time moved slowly, measured not by rulers or calendars, but by seasons, tides, and the steady return of familiar stars. Human life here did not rush forward. It settled in, adapted, and learned to listen. The people we now call the Jōmon lived across these islands for thousands of years, beginning more than 10 millennia ago. They did not build cities, and they left behind no written records to explain themselves. Yet their presence is unmistakable. It rests in the soil, in shell middens along ancient shores, in carefully shaped tools, and above all in their pottery, among the oldest known in the world. These vessels, marked with rope-like impressions, were not hurried objects. They were deliberate, patient creations, suggesting a people who valued continuity and rhythm over conquest or expansion. Jōmon life followed the land closely. Communities were small and often semi-sedentary, returning year after year to the same favored places. Forests provided nuts, roots, and game. Rivers and seas offered fish and shellfish in abundance. Survival did not depend on domination of nature, but on an intimate understanding of it. Knowledge was passed quietly, through observation and shared practice, rather than command. In this world, power was subtle. It lay in experience, in memory, and in the ability to maintain balance. Spiritual life, though silent to us now, seems to have been woven into daily existence. Clay figurines, later called dog, appear across Jōmon sites, often deliberately broken, as if used in rituals connected to healing, fertility, or protection. There was no sharp boundary between the human and the unseen. Mountains, animals, weather, and ancestors likely shared the same moral space. Life was fragile, but not meaningless. It was understood as part of a larger living pattern. Conflict certainly existed, but it was not the defining force of this era. The archaeological record suggests long periods of stability, interrupted by gradual shifts rather than sudden collapse. Climate changes altered food sources, coastlines moved, forests thickened or retreated. The Jōmon adapted again and again, adjusting their tools, dwellings, and habits. Their world did not end in flames or invasion. It slowly transformed. What is most striking about this distant beginning is its patience. For thousands of years, life continued without kingdoms, without armies, without written law. The foundations of Japanese culture were not laid in acts of conquest, but in endurance, in learning how to remain in one place, how to belong to a landscape, and how to accept change without forcing it. Yet change, however gentle, never truly stops. Toward the end of the Jōmon era, new influences began to arrive quietly from across the sea, carrying unfamiliar ideas about food, tools, and social order. These influences would not erase the old world at once, but they would begin to shift it, slowly and irreversibly, toward a different way of living that would reshape the islands forever. Change rarely announces itself with noise. More often, it arrives quietly, carried by unfamiliar hands and new habits that at first seem small and optional. On the Japanese islands, this kind of change began to take shape gradually, almost imperceptibly, as people from the Asian mainland crossed narrow stretches of water and settled among long-established communities. Life did not suddenly break with the past, but it began to bend in a new direction. This period is known as the Yayoi era, and it marked one of the most profound transformations in Japanese history. The most important shift was not political or military, but agricultural. Wet rice cultivation appeared, bringing with it a different relationship to land, time, and labor. Rice demanded cooperation, planning, and patience across entire seasons. Fields had to be prepared, flooded, tended, and defended. Food production became more predictable, but also more demanding. Life grew more structured. With agriculture came permanence. Villages became more fixed, tied to paddies that could not be easily abandoned. Population slowly increased, and communities expanded beyond the small, flexible groups of earlier times. This stability allowed for specialization. Some people focused on farming, others on tool-making, ritual, or leadership. Over time, differences in wealth and status became visible, marked by the size of dwellings, the quality of tools, and the presence of metal objects. Bronze and iron entered the islands during this era, transforming daily life in quiet but lasting ways. Metal tools improved farming efficiency, while weapons altered the balance between groups. Conflict did not dominate the Yayoi world, but it became more consequential. Control of land now meant control of food, and food meant survival through winter and scarcity. Cooperation remained essential, yet competition grew alongside it. Social organization deepened. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of leaders who coordinated irrigation, storage, and defense. Authority no longer rested only in age or experience, but increasingly in control over resources. Ritual objects, such as bronze bells known as dotaku, appeared, often buried carefully rather than used practically. These objects suggest shared beliefs tied to harvest cycles and communal identity, binding people together through ceremony as much as necessity. The Yayoi people did not erase the Jōmon past. Elements of earlier beliefs, aesthetics, and ways of life continued, especially in regions less suited to rice agriculture. Instead, cultures blended unevenly, creating regional differences that would persist for centuries. Japan was not yet a single society, but a mosaic of communities adapting at different speeds. By the later Yayoi centuries, contact with the mainland intensified. Chinese historical records briefly mention island polities, describing them as fragmented yet increasingly organized. Names appear, then fade, hinting at rulers whose authority reached beyond their own villages. The idea of political unity remained distant, but the conditions for it were quietly forming. As fields spread and villages grew, a new question began to shape the future of the islands. Who would lead, and by what right? The answer would not come immediately. It would emerge slowly, through ritual, lineage, and the careful construction of power, a process that would soon leave unmistakable marks upon the land itself. As communities grew larger and more rooted in place, memory itself began to change. The land no longer held only the traces of daily life. It became a canvas for authority. Power sought permanence, and permanence sought form. During the centuries that followed the Yayoi period, leadership in the Japanese islands began to express itself not only through control of resources, but through monument and ritual on an unprecedented scale. This era is known as the Kofun period, named for the massive burial mounds that appeared across the landscape. These tombs, some stretching hundreds of meters in length, were not built in haste. They required enormous labor, careful planning, and the cooperation of entire regions. Their distinctive keyhole shape, visible even today, signaled something new, authority that extended beyond the lifespan of any single individual. The rulers buried within these mounds were more than local leaders. They were figures of lineage, believed to carry sacred legitimacy. Burial goods placed alongside them, bronze mirrors, weapons, armor, and finely crafted ornaments suggest a society increasingly concerned with rank, symbolism, and continuity. Death itself became political, a means of reinforcing order among the living. Around these tombs grew networks of allied clans, bound by marriage, ritual obligation, and shared ancestry. Power was not centralized in the modern sense, but it was becoming layered. The Yamato clan, located in the fertile plains of central Honshu, gradually emerged as the most influential among them. Through diplomacy, ritual authority, and selective force, it extended its influence over neighboring groups, laying the foundations for an early state. Belief and governance intertwined deeply during this time. Ritual specialists mediated between human communities and the unseen forces believed to shape harvests, health, and fortune. Sacred objects, especially mirrors and swords, became symbols of divine favor. Leadership was justified not merely by strength, but by closeness to the sacred past. Authority was inherited, not chosen. Contact with the Asian mainland intensified further. Envoys traveled to and from the Korean peninsula, bringing knowledge of writing, advanced metallurgy, and new forms of governance. Yet adoption was careful and selective. Foreign ideas were not copied wholesale. They were reshaped to fit local traditions and existing power structures. Change remained deliberate. The landscape itself began to reflect this evolving order. Settlements clustered around centers of authority. Roads connected regions, and ceremonial spaces gained importance. Japan was still fragmented, but fragmentation now existed within an emerging hierarchy. Differences between center and periphery became more pronounced, setting the stage for future tensions. By the end of the Kofun period, the idea of a single ruling lineage had taken root, even if its reach remained incomplete. Power had found its symbols, its rituals, and its resting places. The islands were no longer simply inhabited. They were governed, in form if not yet in law. And as authority grew more visible, so did the need for structure, rules, records, and philosophies capable of supporting a broader vision of order. From across the sea came ideas that promised exactly that, quietly preparing to transform Japan's ruling world from ritual power into something far more systematic. When new ideas arrive, they rarely replace what already exists. More often, they settle beside older beliefs, testing them, reshaping them, and slowly changing the way people understand their world. In the centuries that followed the great tomb builders, Japan entered such a period of careful transformation, one guided as much by curiosity as by caution. This era, known as the Asuka period, unfolded at a time when the rulers of the Yamato court looked outward with increasing intent. Across the sea, powerful dynasties in China had developed sophisticated systems of law, writing, philosophy, and religion. These systems promised order, legitimacy, and continuity on a scale Japan had not yet achieved. The question was not whether to adopt them, but how. One of the most significant introductions was writing. With it came the ability to record laws, genealogies, rituals, and agreements beyond the limits of memory. Authority could now be documented, preserved, and transmitted across generations with greater precision. This changed governance quietly but permanently. Power no longer rested only in ritual presence. It could exist on paper, in archives, and in precedent. Buddhism also arrived during this time, carried by envoys and monks from the Korean kingdoms. At first, it was not universally welcomed. Some clans saw it as a threat to existing beliefs, while others recognized its potential to strengthen the authority of the court. Buddhism offered a structured cosmology, moral teachings, and a visual language of temples and icons that could rival any rival clan's rituals. Eventually, the court embraced it as a unifying force, yet Buddhism did not erase earlier spiritual traditions. Indigenous beliefs, later known collectively as Shinto, remained deeply rooted in daily life. Rather than conflict endlessly, the two systems slowly intertwined. Deities were reinterpreted, rituals adapted, and sacred spaces shared. This blending reflected a broader pattern. Japan absorbed foreign ideas without surrendering its core sense of identity. Political reform followed. Influenced by Chinese models, the court attempted to reorganize land ownership, taxation, and rank. Titles were formalized, offices defined, and loyalty directed more clearly toward the central ruler. These changes were ambitious and not always fully realized, but they marked a shift toward a more bureaucratic vision of the state. Architecture also changed the visual language of power. Temples and palaces constructed during the Asuka period used new techniques and styles, signaling openness to continental influence. Stone, tile, and carefully planned layouts replaced earlier forms, creating spaces designed to endure and impress. Despite these advances, the Asuka world remained fragile. Court politics were shaped by rival families, sudden shifts in favor, and quiet intrigue. Reform was a process, not a certainty. Still, the foundations were being laid for something unprecedented, a state defined not only by lineage and ritual, but by law, record, and shared ideology. As the court grew more confident in these borrowed systems, it began to imagine a fully ordered capital, a place where authority could be seen, enacted, and preserved. That vision would soon take form, drawing Japan into its first true experiment with centralized rule. Order, once imagined, seeks a place to settle. After centuries of movement, adaptation, and gradual reform, Japan's ruling elite turned toward stillness, toward the creation of a fixed center from which authority could radiate. This desire shaped the Nara period, an era defined by intention, structure, and the careful imitation of an admired model. In the early 8th century, the court established a permanent capital at Nara, laid out according to Chinese principles of urban planning. Wide avenues, orderly districts, and monumental buildings reflected a belief that political stability could be designed. The city itself became a statement. The state was no longer provisional or symbolic. It was meant to endure. At the heart of this experiment stood the emperor, envisioned as a sacred yet administrative figure, linking heaven and earth through ritual, while presiding over a growing bureaucracy. Laws were compiled, offices staffed, and taxation systems formalized. Land was theoretically owned by the state and redistributed for cultivation, tying farmers directly to imperial authority. On paper, the system was precise and comprehensive. Buddhism reached new prominence during this time, supported actively by the court. Temples were constructed across the provinces, serving not only religious functions but also political ones. They represented unity, moral order, and protection for the realm. The great Buddha of Todaiji, cast in bronze, embodied this vision on an immense scale, a symbol of cosmic harmony anchored in the authority of the state. Yet beneath this impressive surface, tensions quietly grew. The centralized system demanded vast resources, and its ideals often collided with local realities. Aristocratic families maneuvered for influence, using court positions to secure wealth and land. Provincial administrators struggled to enforce policies far from the capital. The state's reach was broad, but its grip was uneven. Religious institutions, initially instruments of unity, also became centers of power in their own right. Wealth accumulated within temples, and monks gained political influence. The boundary between spiritual guidance and worldly authority blurred, complicating governance rather than simplifying it. Daily life, for most people, remained rooted in agriculture, shaped by seasons and obligations. The grand laws of the capital touched them lightly, often through taxes or labor demands, but rarely through protection or prosperity. The ideal of equal land distribution slowly eroded as exemptions and privileges multiplied. By the end of the Nara period, the limitations of strict imitation had become clear. The borrowed systems had provided structure and legitimacy, but they proved difficult to sustain in Japan's diverse landscape. The court began to seek a quieter solution, one that allowed refinement without rigidity, culture without constant reform. That search would lead the capital away from Nara and into an era of elegance, distance, and subtle power, where authority retreated from visible control and found expression in culture, art, and carefully maintained appearances. When the capital moved away from Nara, it did not simply change location, it changed temperament. The new city, Heian-kyo, later known as Kyoto, was designed to preserve order while softening its weight. Here, authority withdrew from constant reform and public display, settling instead into ritual, refinement, and controlled distance from daily affairs. The Heian period marked the height of classical court culture in Japan. Aristocratic families, especially the powerful Fujiwara clan, shaped political life through marriage, ceremony, and quiet influence rather than direct rule. Emperors remained central in theory, but real power often flowed through those who surrounded the throne, guiding decisions gently and invisibly. Life at court became a carefully managed performance. Clothing, poetry, calligraphy, and seasonal observances carried political meaning. To write beautifully, to speak subtly, and to understand unspoken rules was a form of power. Public authority faded into the background, replaced by influence exercised through taste and proximity. This refined world produced remarkable cultural achievements. Court literature, written increasingly in the Japanese vernacular rather than classical Chinese, gave voice to personal emotion and observation. Diaries and tales captured fleeting moments, falling blossoms, passing love, quiet regret, reflecting a worldview deeply aware of impermanence. Beauty was prized precisely because it did not last. Religion continued to evolve alongside this sensibility. Buddhism turned inward, emphasizing personal salvation and ritual protection. Shinto practices remained present, tied to land and ancestry, blending seamlessly with Buddhist thought. The sacred was no longer distant. It existed in daily gestures and seasonal rhythms. Yet beyond the capital's gardens and corridors, a different reality unfolded. The central government's ability to enforce law weakened steadily. Provincial lands slipped into the hands of local elites, often protected by private armed retainers. These warriors, ancestors of the samurai, were practical, disciplined, and increasingly independent from court authority. The court was aware of this shift, but it responded slowly. Its tools were cultural and ceremonial, not military. While Kyoto refined its aesthetics, the provinces learned to manage conflict, defend territory, and administer justice directly. Two worlds developed side by side, connected but increasingly out of balance. By the late Heian period, this imbalance could no longer be ignored. The elegance of the court had preserved tradition, but it had also distanced authority from force. When conflicts arose between powerful families, they were no longer resolved through poetry or protocol. Arms began to decide what refinement could not. As the old order quietly loosened its hold, a new kind of leadership prepared to emerge. One grounded not in lineage alone, but in loyalty, discipline, and the acceptance of violence as a tool of governance. The age of the warrior, long delayed, was beginning to take shape beyond the capital's walls. Power, once separated from force, rarely remains secure for long. As the refined world of the court continued its inward focus, the realities of protection, land, and survival reshaped authority elsewhere. The transition was not sudden, nor was it framed as rebellion. It emerged as a practical response to uncertainty, and from it grew a new structure of rule. By the late 12th century, warrior families had become indispensable. They protected estates, enforced order, and settled disputes that the distant court could no longer manage. Loyalty between warrior and leader was personal, grounded in service and reward rather than ritual rank. This relationship formed the basis of a new political language, one that valued discipline, obligation, and endurance. Conflict between powerful clans eventually brought this shift into full view. The struggle between the Taira and Minamoto families unfolded not only as a contest for influence, but as a turning point in how Japan would be governed. When the Minamoto emerged victorious, they did not attempt to replace the emperor. Instead, they created something new alongside the old. The Kamakura shogunate established a military government led by a shogun who ruled in practice, while the imperial court remained in place as a symbol of continuity. This arrangement reflected a deep cultural instinct: change without rupture. Authority was divided, not abolished. The emperor retained spiritual legitimacy, while the shogun commanded force and administration. Governance under the shogunate was direct and grounded. Land was managed through personal bonds. Justice was administered locally, and loyalty was enforced through obligation rather than ceremony. This system lacked the elegance of the court, but it offered stability in a time of fragmentation. For many, it felt closer to lived reality. Religion adapted once more. New Buddhist movements emphasized simplicity, discipline, and inner resolve, qualities that resonated with warrior values. Zen, in particular, found a natural home among the samurai, offering clarity, acceptance of impermanence, and focus amid uncertainty. Yet this new order carried its own tensions. The balance between court and shogunate required constant adjustment. Regents gained power, rival families maneuvered, and external threats tested the system's strength. When Mongol invasions struck in the 13th century, the shogunate survived, but at great cost. Victory brought honor, but little reward, straining the bonds of loyalty that sustained the regime. By the 14th century, the Kamakura system weakened under its own contradictions. Still, its legacy endured. It had redefined leadership, legitimized military rule, and anchored governance in personal responsibility rather than distant ideals. As the first warrior government faded, it did not erase the path it had opened. Instead, it passed authority to new hands, setting the stage for an age marked by fracture, adaptation, and cultural resilience, a time when power would be contested repeatedly, yet never entirely lost. After the fall of the first warrior government, Japan did not return to earlier certainties. Instead, authority became fluid, contested, and often provisional. The Muromachi period unfolded under the shadow of divided legitimacy, where power shifted frequently, and stability was something to be managed rather than assumed. The Ashikaga shogunate, established in Kyoto's Muromachi district, attempted to balance military rule with courtly tradition. Unlike the distant Kamakura government, this shogunate ruled closer to the emperor and the old aristocracy. This proximity encouraged cultural exchange, but also blurred lines of authority. Governance became a negotiation, shaped by alliances rather than firm control. Regional military governors, known as daimyo, gained increasing autonomy. They collected taxes, maintained armies, and administered justice within their domains, often with minimal interference from the center. The shogunate depended on their cooperation, making unity fragile and conditional. Despite political uncertainty, cultural life flourished. Zen Buddhism continued to shape aesthetics, encouraging simplicity, restraint, and attentiveness. Arts such as ink painting, garden design, tea practice, and no theater developed into enduring forms. These cultural expressions did not ignore turmoil, they absorbed it, offering ways to find balance within instability. Yet peace remained elusive. Rivalries between daimyo intensified, and disputes over succession weakened central authority further. The Onin War, beginning in the mid-15th century, devastated Kyoto and shattered what remained of centralized governance. The conflict resolved little and left lasting damage, both physical and political. In the war's aftermath, Japan entered a long period of fragmentation. Without strong central control, local leaders acted independently, forging alliances or waging wars as circumstances demanded. Law became regional, loyalty personal, and survival uncertain. This was not chaos in the sense of constant violence, but a world where order had to be rebuilt repeatedly. Religion once again offered solace and structure. Temples served as centers of learning, refuge, and economic activity. Belief systems adapted to local needs, reinforcing community bonds in the absence of reliable political protection. The Muromachi period revealed a paradox. As political unity weakened, cultural coherence deepened. Shared values, rituals, and aesthetics continued to bind society together, even as authority fractured. Japan was divided, but it was not dissolving. As generations passed, the conditions created by this fragmentation began to produce leaders shaped by relentless conflict, individuals who understood that peace would not emerge from tradition alone. From this prolonged uncertainty would arise a new determination to unify the land by force, decisiveness, and vision, ushering in an age defined by struggle and transformation. After the fall of the first warrior government, Japan did not return to earlier certainties. Instead, authority became fluid, contested, and often provisional. The Muromachi period unfolded under the shadow of divided legitimacy, where power shifted frequently, and stability was something to be managed rather than assumed. The Ashikaga shogunate, established in Kyoto's Muromachi district, attempted to balance military rule with courtly tradition. Unlike the distant Kamakura government, this shogunate ruled closer to the emperor and the old aristocracy. This proximity encouraged cultural exchange but also blurred lines of authority. Governance became a negotiation, shaped by alliances rather than firm control. Regional military governors, known as daimyo, gained increasing autonomy. They collected taxes, maintained armies, and administered justice within their domains, often with minimal interference from the center. The shogunate depended on their cooperation, making unity fragile and conditional. despite political uncertainty, cultural life flourished. Zen Buddhism continued to shape aesthetics, encouraging simplicity, restraint, and attentiveness. Arts such as ink painting, garden design, tea practice, and no theater developed into enduring forms. These cultural expressions did not ignore turmoil, they absorbed it, offering ways to find balance within instability. Yet peace remained elusive. Rivalries between daimyo intensified, and disputes over succession weakened central authority further. The Onin War, beginning in the mid-15th century, devastated Kyoto and shattered what remained of centralized governance. The conflict resolved little and left lasting damage, both physical and political. In the war's aftermath, Japan entered a long period of fragmentation. Without strong central control, local leaders acted independently, forging alliances or waging wars as circumstances demanded. Law became regional, loyalty personal, and survival uncertain. This was not chaos in the sense of constant violence, but a world where order had to be rebuilt repeatedly. Religion once again offered solace and structure. Temples served as centers of learning, refuge, and economic activity. Belief systems adapted to local needs, reinforcing community bonds in the absence of reliable political protection. The Muromachi period revealed a paradox. As political unity weakened, cultural coherence deepened. Shared values, rituals, and aesthetics continued to bind society together, even as authority fractured. Japan was divided, but it was not dissolving. As generations passed, the conditions created by this fragmentation began to produce leaders shaped by relentless conflict. Individuals who understood that peace would not emerge from tradition alone. From this prolonged uncertainty would arise a new determination to unify the land by force, decisiveness, and vision, ushering in an age defined by struggle and transformation. When long uncertainty hardens into habit, conflict becomes routine rather than exceptional. This was the quiet reality of the Sengoku period, an age often remembered for its wars, yet shaped just as deeply by adaptation, endurance, and the search for order amid constant risk. Authority during this time was not inherited securely. It was tested daily. With central power fractured, regional warlords ruled according to their own strength and judgment. Alliances shifted without ceremony, and loyalty was measured by results. Castles rose across the landscape, not only as military structures, but as administrative centers, anchoring power in stone and earth. The land itself became divided into defended worlds, each governed by its own rules. Yet even in this era of struggle, life continued beyond the battlefield. Farmers worked fields under the protection and burden of local lords. Merchants traveled cautiously, supplying armies and towns alike. Villages learned to survive by negotiation as much as obedience, adjusting to whichever authority prevailed at the moment. Leadership evolved under pressure. Successful daimyo understood that force alone was insufficient. They implemented land surveys, standardized taxation, and enforced laws within their domains. Discipline and efficiency became tools of survival. Some leaders rose not from noble lineage, but from talent and opportunity, signaling a subtle shift in social assumptions. Contact with the outside world increased during this time. European traders and missionaries arrived, introducing firearms, new goods, and unfamiliar beliefs. Firearms altered warfare decisively, favoring organization over individual skill. Foreign influence was assessed pragmatically, adopted where useful, contained where disruptive. Amid chaos, cultural life adapted rather than disappeared. tea gatherings emphasized simplicity and controlled space, offering moments of calm within uncertainty. Philosophy and ritual provided structure to minds shaped by impermanence. Even war produced its own codes, defining honor, obligation, and restraint. Over time, the endless cost of conflict became clear. Fields left uncultivated, villages displaced, and generations raised in uncertainty created a shared exhaustion. The desire for peace grew stronger, not as an ideal, but as a necessity. From this environment emerged leaders capable of imagining unity. They understood war intimately, yet sought to end it decisively. Through strategy, reform, and relentless effort, the fractured land began to draw inward once more. The Sengoku Age did not conclude gently, but it did prepare the ground for peace. Out of constant struggle arose the conditions for lasting order, an order that would soon be imposed firmly, carefully, and with a determination shaped by everything that had come before. Peace, when it finally arrives after generations of conflict, rarely feels gentle at first. It is imposed, structured, and guarded closely, shaped by the memory of chaos it seeks to prevent. In Japan, the long era of warfare ended not through negotiation, but through decisive consolidation, giving rise to a new political order that would endure for centuries. The Tokugawa shogunate emerged at the beginning of the 17th century, establishing its seat in Edo, a city that would later become Tokyo. The new regime did not simply claim authority. It reorganized society to preserve it. Power was centralized, but carefully distributed, ensuring that no single lord could easily challenge the shogun. Former warlords were allowed to retain their lands, yet they were bound by strict obligations. Regular residence in Edo, elaborate systems of hostages, and detailed regulations on military capacity limited independence. These measures were not temporary. They became the framework of daily governance, quietly reshaping behavior across generations. Social order was formalized with clarity. Society was divided into classes: warriors, farmers, artisans, and merchants, each with defined roles and expectations. Mobility between these groups became rare. Stability replaced ambition as the guiding principle. The memory of war made predictability desirable, even if it came at the cost of flexibility. Foreign contact was restricted sharply. Christianity, once tolerated, was suppressed, and European presence was limited to tightly controlled channels. This isolation was not complete withdrawal, but selective engagement. Knowledge still entered Japan through approved routes, filtered and adapted without threatening internal balance. Life under Tokugawa rule settled into rhythm. Villages focused on agriculture. Towns expanded as centers of trade, and culture flourished within constraints. Literature, theater, and visual art explored themes of impermanence, duty, and quiet rebellion. Even within order, human complexity remained. The shogunate maintained peace not through constant force, but through surveillance, ritual, and habit. Generations grew up without war, knowing authority as something steady and distant. This peace reshaped expectations. Conflict became a memory rather than a constant presence. Yet stability carried its own tensions. Economic change favored merchants, while warriors struggled with fixed stipends. Intellectual currents questioned old hierarchies. The system endured, but beneath its calm surface, pressures slowly accumulated. The Tokugawa peace succeeded because it remembered the cost of disorder. But time, as always, introduced new forces. As the world beyond Japan changed, the quiet confidence of isolation would begin to strain, not abruptly, but steadily. preparing the ground for a transformation few could yet imagine. Long periods of peace tend to soften the urgency of power while sharpening awareness of imbalance. By the later years of Tokugawa rule, Japan had grown accustomed to stability, yet that very stability began to reveal its limits. The structures that once preserved order now constrained adaptation, and the calm surface of society concealed a slow but persistent shift. Life in the countryside remained demanding. Farmers bore the weight of taxation, their labor sustaining both local lords and distant authorities. Crop failures and natural disasters tested this balance repeatedly, and while the system endured, it did so unevenly. Hardship was managed, not resolved, creating quiet resentment rather than open revolt. In the cities, a different tension emerged. Merchants, officially placed low in the social hierarchy, accumulated wealth and influence through trade and finance. Samurai, bound by tradition and fixed incomes, often found themselves economically dependent on those they were meant to outrank. This reversal unsettled long-held assumptions about status and value. Intellectual life reflected this unease. Scholars turned increasingly to practical studies, history, and ethics, questioning whether existing institutions truly served the common good. Some looked inward, seeking renewal through a return to classical ideals. Others looked outward, curious about the wider world pressing against Japan's borders. That pressure grew steadily. Western ships appeared with increasing frequency, carrying demands rather than requests. Their presence exposed the limitations of isolation. Military technology, global trade, and shifting power dynamics made it clear that the balance carefully maintained within Japan existed in a world that no longer stood still. The shogunate responded cautiously, attempting reform without dismantling its foundations. Yet internal divisions slowed decisive action. Loyalty to tradition competed with the need for change, and authority hesitated, aware that any misstep could unravel generations of peace. Among regional leaders and younger samurai, a different mood took hold. They sensed that survival required transformation, not preservation alone. Allegiance to the emperor, long symbolic, gained new political meaning as a potential source of unity beyond the shogunate. By the mid-19th century, the old order had not collapsed, but it had begun to thin. Its rituals remained, its laws enforced, yet confidence faltered. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how it would arrive, and who would shape it. As external pressure intensified and internal debate deepened, Japan stood at a quiet threshold. The next steps would be rapid, disruptive, and decisive, carrying the nation from inherited order into deliberate reinvention. When change finally came, it moved faster than many expected, carried forward by urgency rather than caution. The Meiji Restoration was not a single event, but a swift realignment of power, belief, and purpose. In a short span of years, structures that had shaped life for centuries were set aside in favor of something untested and ambitious. Authority was formally returned to the emperor, whose role shifted from symbolic presence to active center of governance. This restoration did not revive an ancient system unchanged. It reimagined it. The emperor became a unifying figure around whom reform could gather legitimacy, allowing decisive action without the appearance of rupture. The shogunate was dismantled, and with it the class structures that had sustained Tokugawa order. Samurai privileges were abolished, stipends ended, and the monopoly on violence transferred to a national army. These changes were painful and disorienting, especially for those whose identities had been shaped by inherited roles. Yet resistance was limited. The pace of reform left little time for hesitation. Japan's leaders studied foreign models closely, sending envoys abroad and inviting advisors in. They examined constitutions, industries, educational systems, and military organization, selecting what they believed could strengthen the state. This process was neither blind imitation nor passive acceptance. It was deliberate, strategic, and intensely pragmatic. Education became central to this transformation. Schools expanded rapidly, promoting literacy, technical knowledge, and a shared national narrative. Loyalty shifted from local domain to nation, from personal lord to abstract state. Identity was redefined quietly but thoroughly. Industrialization followed. Railways, factories, and modern infrastructure altered landscapes and rhythms of life. Urban centers expanded, drawing people away from villages and into new forms of labor. The pace was demanding, often harsh, but driven by a conviction that strength depended on parity with global powers. Traditional culture did not disappear, but it was reframed. Customs were preserved as symbols of continuity rather than foundations of governance. The past was honored, yet firmly placed behind the momentum of progress. Within a generation, Japan had transformed itself from a secluded feudal society into a modern state with centralized authority and global awareness. The success of this effort brought pride, but also expectation, the belief that survival required constant strength and vigilance. As Japan found its place among nations, it also absorbed new ideas about power and destiny. The tools that secured independence would soon be turned outward, shaping a future defined not only by renewal, but by ambition and expansion beyond the islands themselves. Modernization brought confidence, and confidence, over time, reshaped how Japan understood its place in the world. The decades following the Meiji transformation were marked by intense effort, not only to strengthen the nation internally, but to ensure that it would never again be vulnerable to outside control. Security and status became closely linked, and both were pursued with determination. Industrial growth accelerated, factories multiplied, cities expanded, and transportation networks bound the country together more tightly than ever before. The state worked closely with emerging industrial groups, creating an economy capable of supporting modern armies and navies. Progress was measured, planned, and celebrated, reinforcing a shared sense of national purpose. Alongside economic change came political evolution. A constitution was introduced, and representative institutions took shape. These structures offered participation and debate, yet authority remained concentrated. The language of democracy existed alongside strong executive power, reflecting a balance between inclusion and control that mirrored broader tensions within society. Military success reinforced confidence. Victories in conflicts against regional powers demonstrated that Japan had mastered the tools of modern warfare. These outcomes were interpreted not only as strategic achievements, but as confirmation of national destiny. The belief took hold that strength justified leadership, and leadership required expansion. Education and public discourse emphasized unity, duty, and sacrifice. Loyalty to the emperor and state was framed as both moral obligation and personal identity. Individual ambition aligned increasingly with collective purpose, narrowing the space for dissent without eliminating it entirely. Expansion overseas followed gradually, presented as protection of interests rather than conquest. Territories were absorbed, administrations established, and resources secured. Each step appeared logical within the prevailing worldview, even as it deepened Japan's involvement in global power struggles. Yet expansion carried costs. Governing distant lands required force, surveillance, and compromise. Resistance was met with firmness and sometimes severity, shaping experiences that would leave lasting memories across the region. Within Japan, debate continued quietly over direction and consequence, often constrained by prevailing expectations of loyalty. By the early 20th century, Japan stood as a major power, respected and watched closely. Its transformation was undeniable, its ambitions clear. But the world it navigated was unstable, shaped by rivalries and unresolved tensions that no single nation could fully control. As international pressures intensified and choices narrowed, Japan faced a future where strength alone would not guarantee security. The path of expansion, once seen as protection, would soon draw the nation into a conflict vast enough to test every assumption upon which its modern identity had been built. Total war alters not only nations, but memory itself. As Japan entered the mid-20th century, the ambitions that had once felt protective became binding commitments, narrowing options, and accelerating momentum. Decisions made over decades converged into a conflict that reached far beyond borders, drawing the nation into an experience from which there would be no partial return. Mobilization reshaped daily life. Industry turned toward military production. Cities reorganized around efficiency and sacrifice. And civilians were drawn into the effort through labor, rationing, and expectation. The language of duty deepened, asking endurance rather than reflection. War became an atmosphere as much as an event. As conflict expanded across Asia and the Pacific, the scale of destruction grew steadily. Battles consumed resources, lives, and attention, while distant victories failed to secure lasting advantage. The strain accumulated quietly at first, then unmistakably. Supply lines weakened, cities grew vulnerable, and exhaustion settled into the fabric of society. Air raids brought the war home with relentless clarity. Urban centers were reduced to ash, and civilians bore losses once imagined only at the front. Survival became immediate and personal, narrowing perspective to the next hour, the next night. Ideals persisted, but they were carried now by fatigue rather than confidence. Defeat, when it came, arrived with finality. The surrender ended the fighting, but it also dissolved assumptions that had guided modern Japan from its earliest reforms. Authority shifted abruptly, and the nation entered a period of occupation unlike any it had known before. Occupation brought constraint and opportunity together. Institutions were dismantled or restructured, laws rewritten, and responsibilities reassigned. The emperor remained, but transformed, no longer a divine anchor, but a symbol of continuity within a new framework. The language of governance changed, emphasizing peace, rights, and restraint. For many, this period was defined by loss and adjustment. Cities rebuilt slowly, families mourned, and identity itself felt uncertain. Yet, amid devastation, a different resolve took shape. Quieter, less assertive, but deeply rooted in survival. The reckoning of war did not erase Japan's past, it reframed it. Memory became something to carry carefully, informing choices rather than directing them. As occupation ended and sovereignty returned, Japan faced the task of renewal, not as a return to former ambition, but as a deliberate commitment to stability, reconstruction, and a future shaped by hard-earned restraint. Rebuilding begins not with certainty, but with patience. In the years following occupation, Japan moved forward quietly, guided by the awareness of how much had been lost and how carefully the future would need to be shaped. There was no grand declaration of renewal, only steady effort, repeated day after day. Political life settled into a new rhythm. Institutions emphasized continuity, compromise, and predictability. Power was exercised cautiously, framed by law and limited by memory. The nation chose restraint as policy, defining security not through expansion, but through stability and alliance. This decision, shaped by experience rather than theory, would influence every decade that followed. Economic recovery unfolded gradually, then with increasing momentum. Factories reopened, technologies improved, and education expanded. Work became central to identity, not as sacrifice for the state, but as contribution to collective recovery. Urban landscapes changed once more, rising from ruins into centers of industry and innovation. Tradition did not disappear in this process. It adapted. Festivals, rituals, and arts remained woven into daily life, offering continuity amid change. The past was neither rejected nor idealized. It existed as context, something acknowledged, learned from, and carried forward without dominance. Social expectations shifted subtly. Authority became less distant, community more horizontal. The balance between individual and collective was renegotiated, often quietly, through everyday choices rather than ideological debate. Stability itself became a shared value, earned through effort rather than imposed. As Japan entered the global community anew, it did so with caution and awareness. Economic success brought influence, yet memory tempered ambition. The nation learned to exist in tension between modernity and heritage, innovation and restraint, movement and stillness. Looking back across its long history, Japan's story does not follow a single direction. It moves in cycles of openness and withdrawal, conflict and order, adaptation and continuity. Each era reshaped what came after, leaving traces rather than conclusions. In the present, those layers remain visible. Ancient beliefs echo in modern cities. Past conflicts inform present caution. The islands continue to balance isolation and connection, shaped by geography, memory, and choice. History here does not end. It settles, waits, and quietly unfolds, as it always has, carried forward by people living within time, aware that the future is never separate from what came before, only another chapter moving patiently toward the horizon.